What's up guys, TechLab here. Now we're going to be kicking off the new year with a look at a graphics card, but it's not just any graphics card. This is my dream graphics card. It has taken me 4 years for me to finally manage to pick one of these up, but is it actually still worth it? Well, today, that's what we're going to be finding out. Now, all the way back in 2020, AMD released what was probably their best graphics card generation ever in the form of the RX 6000 series. The whole lineup of graphics card gave AMD a very good opportunity to close the gap finally on NVIDIA, as well as being able to set some very decent price ranges. As part of that lineup, of course, we had the AMD Radeon RX 6800 XT, which is this card here. It was a fantastically fast card, really closed the gap on the RTX 3080, and it didn't really cost that much either. This card had a retail price of around $650, which was amazing for the performance you were getting, but AMD did have a little bit of a challenge on the hand because they dropped it at the wrong time. And by that I mean, as soon as this card released, we had the GPU crisis, we had GPU mining, and we had all of the lockdowns. So everybody was buying up all the graphics cards, and the only way that most gamers could actually find one was a scalped version on eBay. That meant that to get one of these graphics cards, you were paying up to about 3 times the price, which clearly just didn't make them worth it. So even though a lot of them did sell, not many of them actually made it into gaming PCs. But now, 4 years later, things are completely different. I managed to pick this card up for a lot less than the original retail price, but is it actually worth it now in 2025? Now, even though the RX 6800 XT wasn't the flagship of the time, it was still classed as a high-end graphics card. It was sitting with an RDNA 2 architecture, a base clock speed of 1825 MHz. It has 4608 shaders, as well as 16 GB of GDDR6 VRAM. It sits with a memory bus of 256-bit with a PCI Gen 4x16 interface, and it had a TDP of around 300 watts. And like we said before, it was released for around $649, which actually made it amazing for the performance you were getting if you could actually pick one up. And like I say, not many people actually managed to do it. Now, the model that I've managed to pick up recently is the reference model, is the one that I've always wanted. Back in 2020, I was sitting on an RX 5700 XT. I absolutely loved that graphics card. It was more than powerful enough, but I really wanted an upgrade. And as soon as I saw these announced, I thought, this is definitely the one that I want. Unfortunately though, I fell into the pit of other gamers because I just couldn't find one in stock, and I wasn't willing to pay nearly 3 times as much from a scalper, so I ended up eventually waiting a little bit and picking up an RTX 3070 Ti. That was the only thing I could find in stock anywhere on any kind of UK based store, and I overpaid for it, and to be honest, it was the world's most boring graphics card. This one though is the one that I always wanted. It was my dream graphics card. I finally managed to pick it up, and it hasn't disappointed. The thing looks absolutely beautiful. If you take a look at it from the front here, we have a fantastic cooling solution, even being a reference model, and it has this beautiful silver X in the middle. We also have a light up logo on the side, which lights up in red, so you do kind of need to theme it a little bit with a red system, but because it's got this red lipstick style kind of logo emblem on the side, you kind of have to do that anyway. But it still looks great in a system, whether you put it this way, whether it actually is normal way. And it also comes with 2 twin 8-pin connections, which are pretty standard. So they didn't actually try to attempt to put any kind of new power connection on there. They just went pretty standard with what works, and I think it really paid off. Now, this card does look amazing no matter which way you line it up. If you were to vertically mount, it looks great. If you just install it into a system just like this in the more traditional way that we would do it, it still looks great. But it is 4 years old now, and even though it was a high-end graphics card before, it's not necessarily classed as that nowadays. So how well will it perform when it comes to some modern games? Since 2020, we've had some real super demanding games delivered, so hopefully this card doesn't struggle too much. But obviously, to find that out, we've had to do some testing. So let's take a look at some of the benchmarks and see exactly how well this card stands up today. Now, being a high-end graphics card, when it was released, this card was actually targeted towards the 1440p and the 4K resolutions. And to be honest, for games that were around back then, it clearly could play them, absolutely no issues at all. But of course, taking a look at those benchmarks, some of the more super modern games are kind of really testing that theory now. Because this card was geared more towards the 1440p and 4K resolutions, there's absolutely no point looking at the 1080p. You will get a fantastic experience no matter what the game is without any kind of help in 1080p, even though it did actually show a weakness in our CPU here. Our testing system uses a Ryzen 7 5800X3D, and it was actually the bottleneck with this graphics card. So if you are going to be gaming in 1080p, you'll have absolutely no issues. Just make sure you've got the CPU to be able to handle it. Moving up to 4K, you can see that this card is just not really there anymore, particularly when we're running in native resolutions with high presets. That's something that it used to be able to do quite well, but for games like Alan Wake 2, you do see a big drop in performance here, particularly with a high preset, where we saw an average of 29 frames per second with a 1% low of 14. A similar pattern across all of the other games. The older the game, the higher obviously the results are, but even in things like Stalker 2, we still only managed to get just over 30 frames per second, so probably not quite geared up anymore for 4K, particularly with native resolutions. So we dropped to its sweet spot, which is of course 1440p. Now in 1440p, you can get playable experiences across the board with all of the games that we tested. The lowest games being Alan Wake 2, where we only managed to see an average of 58 frames per second with a 1% low of 35. Still playable, but we'd love to get that 1% low up a little bit. And of course, Space Marine 2 was another game where it was a little bit low here, only managing to average around 78 frames per second with a 1% low of 55. Now, just because those games don't have the super high kind of performance that you'd expect from games on a card like this, it doesn't mean that the card is absolutely useless, because it's 2025 now. We have lots of useful tools that we can throw at a card like this, which it was actually designed for. So if we do a little bit of custom testing, can we actually bring those up for those really demanding games? And of course the answer is yes. If you want to actually get a high FPS experience with Alan Wake 2 in 1440p, all you need to do is drop the preset down to a medium and enable FSR2 with a balanced setting. This will actually net you around 117 frames per second on average with a 1% low of 71. You cannot tell an absolute difference between the quality of game here. It plays beautifully smooth. And if for anybody that does want to get around 120 FPS out of a single player game, it is definitely an option that you can take. Space Marine 2 was very easily fixed here, running the game in 1440p, continuing on with the high preset. All you needed to do was enable FSR with a native resolution, and of course enable frame generation. Frame generation is a technology that is available to pretty much all graphics cards now, and for the 6000 series it works beautifully as well. With this kind of setting, you'll manage to get an average of around 101 frames per second, which we're going to class as a high FPS experience with a 1% low of 88. With a quick mention here of Stalker 2 being the newest game on our list, it is a very demanding game, and a lot of graphics cards have really struggled with it, but with the 6800 XT, it doesn't take a lot to get 120 FPS experience here, leaving the game in 1440p with a high resolution while enabling FSR with a very basic quality setting. You can get around 120 frames per second with a 1% low of 98. There is absolutely no need for frame generation on most of these games to really bring up those 1440p performances, so overall the card actually does look great. The one shining example here, as always, is of course Doom Eternal. Running this game in 1440p in ultra nightmare setting with enabling ray tracing, you can actually get an average of 156 frames per second with a 1% low of 103, which actually means that when you come to play those slightly older, more well optimized games, you can actually even enable ray tracing, and the 6800 XT will just blow straight through it. Absolutely no issues at all. Now, like I say, it's taken me 4 years to be able to manage to pick this card up, and in actual fact I only paid just over £300 for this with an MSRP of around $650 or £650. It was still actually worth it back then. Nowadays, not so much, of course, because they've come down in price. But if you can actually manage to get one of these for around £300 or just over, you're actually getting a pretty decent graphics card for that. You're going to blow most games out of the water with it in whatever resolution you want. If you wanted to go to 4K, you could enable a lot of those software tools, including frame generation, and it'll still manage to get a 60 FPS experience. So either way, you're going to be gold with this kind of card. I am super impressed with its performance even 4 years later. I think anybody with one of these graphics cards, they're going to have it for a while still. It's still going to last a bit. I'm not 100% sure what I'm going to do with this graphics card yet. I might upgrade one of the studio systems with it because I just think it's a waste to have sitting on a shelf, even though it looks beautiful and stuff. But we do have some more content that we want to do on this card, so make sure you subscribe to the channel if you want to catch that. Also, let me know in the comments below what you think of the RX 6800 XT. Do you have one? Would you like one? What kind of games would you play if you did have one, or if you do have one? And I'm sure, as always, I'll catch you guys in the next one.